Good morning. Wow, and welcome back to HUBzero 2015. Still a little bit of time to grab some coffee, but I'd like to go ahead and introduce the first speaker for this morning. We have Michael Zentner, as you know, the new director of the HUBzero platform, and he'll be here this morning talking about data. So welcome, Michael Zentner.
Good morning. So I'm going to talk today about a rather strange title to the talk here. Hopefully you'll understand what I mean by that title. As I go forward, I was talking to our HR director from Purdue last night who came down to help celebrate with Mike at the dinner, and she said, I understand what your talk is about. So that I thought that might be a good sign. I'm giving this talk today as a customer of HUBzero, not as the incoming director of HUBzero. I agreed to give the talk before I even knew that was going to happen, so if I'm complaining at all, I'm complaining to myself, but hopefully I'm not complaining too much. And hopefully, based on what I heard yesterday, a lot of the kind of things that I'm facing with two relatively new projects here, one that's associated with nanoHUB and one that's associated with what's called the Reagan Street National Center for Medical Device Informatics. I think many of you are working on some very similar kinds of issues with data, maybe a little bit further along than I am and with our group on some of the issues that we're facing in these. So I'm going to present a lot of problems and not a whole lot of solutions today because it's really been a short span of time that we've been working on these issues. But why do I say that employees and data are analogous? A lot like employees, you can retrain data in some respects to be useful to you. You can coax insight out of data that it might not know that it has. But unlike an employee, you're stuck with your data. You can't fire it, you can't get new data. All you can do is massage it and change the way it's generated in the future. I want to talk about some past transformations that have happened with data. And in particular, when you look at the world of business intelligence that's occurred over the last 10 years and intelligence dashboards, they've really been instrumental in taking something like this, which is a balance sheet for a hospital, which is totally useless for making any kind of reasonable decision at all, and transformed it into a context-sensitive dashboard that actually contains information broken down in a much more useful way that helps you make decisions. For example, if I look at this portion of the dashboard, I can see an easy breakdown of how many overtime hours have been spent by department. You would never get this on a balance sheet, but with a BI dashboard you can do this. And so these technologies have brought us very nice summarization and drill down skills that happen very efficiently in the form of data cubes. And they've helped us answer questions like how much, what's happening, which are all very useful things to answer for decision-making perspective. But when we think about the kinds of questions we have to answer in science and in business today, we're more concerned with what's going to happen in the future. And given a bunch of things that are happening now, what should I look at strategically as a decision in the future? And how can I cope with this information to do these kind of things? And these are much harder types of questions to answer than sort of the roll-up questions that I talked about just a minute ago. To give you one example of that concrete from my history, a hard lesson I learned in analytics, I was working with a new social network company on the order of 9 years ago that was generating new subscribers at a clip of about 25,000 per month, a quarter of which were paying $10 a month to join. And when you look at what that represents, it's over $60,000 not in revenue, but in new revenue every month. So these guys were growing at an incredible clip, but it wasn't good enough for them. They wanted to know, how can we get more than 25% of our people to pay by looking at what the 25% who pay do, and try to extrapolate that to the people who don't pay and lure them into paying. Well, being an engineer, I thought, what better way to do this than equip them with one of the most powerful dashboards they can possibly have that allows them to drag and drop data and query it in just about any way possible Mix of structured data with unstructured textual data. And we did a great deal of work on this. Took it to their boardroom, had a discussion, demo, showed them what we were doing. Everybody was very positive about this great possibility to look at data. A coworker of mine is in the room, Damien Junk in the back row there, who was also involved with this activity. And the decision maker at the end of the discussion said, well, that's really great, but I want this. I want the Staples Easy button. Just press it and tell me what to do. And my response to him was, well, that's an impossible button. I can't do that and tell you what to do. And even if I could do that, I would press the button myself. I would pocket the cash and you'd never see me again. Luckily, I didn't think it was possible. To be scientifically correct, I should say it's likely impossible in my opinion. That doesn't necessarily mean there are others that don't think that it is possible, and maybe they'll get there. We've seen great things come out of things like IBM Watson, not to pick just on IBM, but they do seem to say otherwise. But sometimes IBM Watson just isn't up to certain tasks, and we expect a little bit too much. So if you want one of the weirdest recipes for a burrito, you can go look this up on the web. It doesn't sound too good to me, but it's very creative. And what's missing here is that contextual knowledge that, I told these people that I can't look at your data and tell you what to do because I don't know your business well enough. Or in this case, I wouldn't know your science well enough to know what kind of decisions to make, but you certainly do. And my job is to equip you with tools that help you amplify what you're capable of doing with that knowledge. So I think today, whereas 9 years ago people weren't ready to hear the message that data just equals answers. If you got data, you can generate answers. There's machines that do this. Today, I think people are more receptive to hearing that, well, if you combine data with domain expertise, visuals, interactivity, people, you can actually get answers. But it's a process. It's not just magic that causes this to occur. So, on to the sort of main theme of the talk. I'll talk about several types of bad employee behaviors that everybody's probably seen. First being the information hoarder. Doesn't allow information to escape. Data are a lot like this. They contain information. It's really difficult to distill information out of data. And so when you're typically looking at a set of data for the first time, what you're looking at is this. Total darkness. You don't know what's there. Trying to query it is your first step into frustration. And maybe our first step into doing a query is something like an SQL, like you see up here. I don't expect you to understand what's in the SQL, it's just there as a sample. And typically what's going to happen to you as you begin this process is you're going to get back nothing, or you're going to get back a set of results, but not a whole lot of guidance about what you're getting in those results. Think about that initial set of results perhaps as this little set of specks of light that show up on the screen here. Wouldn't it be nice if query systems not only gave you back exactly what you asked for, which they do today, they give you exactly that and nothing else, but also said to you, hey, if you reformulated your query just a little bit in that neighborhood, you might have discovered these other items of interest that you didn't because of how you initially formulated your question. Or maybe even more interestingly, if you were to go look at these other places, we think we know you're looking for a certain kind of feature. You might find a lot more rich information in those areas. And if we had that kind of system, we might be able to, over time, better understand the data space that we're trying to query and really see what its structure is and where the useful and non-useful information is within that set. So imagine the same situation I was talking about. And the question when you get no results typically is, well, what do I do next if I want to get results? Or if I do have a set of results, what else would I want to know about those results? And think about, figuratively speaking, perhaps a system that takes your initial query, generates perturbations on that query, issues many more queries, and uses those as a summary of sort of those neighborhoods that you might want to look at next. So you got 0 results, but maybe you should look here. Or you got a set of results, and it looks like based on what you're looking at, you should be interested in these other things. Or maybe even better, you didn't even ask for this, but structurally the things that you pulled out of the data are similar to these other areas that you might want to look at also. So this is one of our challenges, is to take these three sort of types of queries, and I'm going to rename them as a redirective, elaborative, and extrapolative queries, and generate a system that's capable of providing this kind of guidance as you walk through sets of data. So that's challenge number one. Bad employee number two, not trying to fit in. There certainly are people who are highly talented and don't fit in and they get away with it, but most people don't. Same is true with trying to work with data. They don't fit together. Again, figuratively speaking, think of data as having a shape. So let's talk about one kind of data as patient, date of service, drug administered, maybe not a diagnosis code, but a charge for medical services. And let's say those data are shaped like this purple thing. And maybe I've got many other data just like that. But I also might have data of a slightly different structure, shaped like these yellow things. And maybe these don't contain drug administered, but they do contain a diagnosis code. And you can kind of see what we're doing here is we're creating a tabular structure to store these data. And it's not a perfect structure because not every piece of data has every property, but it's a decent enough structure. And if you add maybe a few more types of data to that overall picture, eventually when you try to pack those together into a database, roughly speaking, it fits fairly well, even though every row is not identical to every other row. So I call it like a semi-homogeneous data structure or database. And it works pretty well from a tabular standpoint. When I say semi-homogeneous, I mean you can throw it into a table and it's not almost all empty. By contrast, we're working on a completely different project in nanotechnology in the area of nano-environmental. And the data that these folks are storing is toxicity data, molecular structure data, environmental fate and transport, various organ uptake and physical measurements. So none of these data look like each other, yet they want to use them all together in combinations to answer questions like, if I start dumping this silver particle in the environment, will people die? And you can see how a question like that would require assembly of all these kinds of data going forward. Complicating that process just a little bit more is that as these things are measured, there's the method of experiment. And not surprisingly, everybody uses different methods of experiment. So those in effect twist those data just a little bit off of each other so that they fit together even less. So as we try to look at an ensemble of these data and how we're going to put those together into a sensible computational structure, we can't do it. They don't fit in obviously in a tabular form. So here we're looking at some of the non-SQL solutions that we're talking about yesterday as to how we're going to do this, and realizing that sort of sacrifices our ability to do fairly simple and powerful queries against the data. We have to sort of trade that off against being able to actually represent the data in an expandable way as people change experimental methods, as they change the data that they've filled in and so forth. So our challenge here is not only to store experimental data in a strange data structure, but also couple it with a methodological compendium of how it was generated. Oh, and by the way, make it completely browsable, searchable, discoverable, and combinable. These problems haven't all been solved. Again, this is a fairly new effort that's been going on. Our partners here are the Center for Environmental Implications on Nanotechnology and the Nanomaterial Registry. And I hope to have more to say about a couple of these projects a year from now as they move forward. Challenge number 3 that we face is sparse knowledge. Employees don't always have the knowledge they need to solve the problems we ask them to solve. Neither do data. So let me start the discussion here by talking about dense data. If I run an experiment in my lab, I have pretty much a full table of results. It's pretty dense. I know exactly what it is. If, however, my neighbor then runs an experiment in their lab, chances are they didn't line their experiment up exactly with mine. So as I try to combine these two pieces of data together in a common set, I might actually have more questions that I didn't anticipate than I do answers. If I take not just my neighbor, but maybe the field of nano-environmental as a whole, I'm going to have many more data sets populating this space, but maybe I'm going to have many more questions too about what don't I know? Taking that one step further and say nanotech as a whole, again, a lot more data sets, a lot more questions. And what you see happening here is basically that as we collect data, we're growing, and we try to consider those data together in one system, we're growing the size of our universe faster than our ability to fill it in with data, creating this knowledge gap. And what that basically creates for us is a sparse data problem. So why is that a problem? Well, our typical way of looking at data are through tables. But when a table is really wide, really tall, and pretty much empty, this mechanism for browsing data breaks down. So another project that we're working on, and it's actually up on nanoHUB in a very early version right now, is how to explore sparse tables or sparse data in a different way. Why is that important? Well, if you take a tabular view and you try to impose it on a sparse set of data, what a table doesn't show you is the fact that sparse data actually has a landscape associated with it. And you have more of a chance of either running into a wall or running off of a ledge and not finding data than you do of actually finding something if your tool that you're using doesn't give you an advanced view of this landscape as you start to take exploration actions. So our challenge here is to provide a highly interactive environment and a landscape view of data sets. As I said, there is a version of this for the nanomaterial registry that exists on nanoHUB right now. I apologize that there aren't really any how-to videos with it yet to tell you some of the things that the tools do. We'll be working on putting some of those together. But we're definitely going in this direction. Bad employee number 4 is the perpetually not organized employee, and I think we all know that everybody takes data in their own way, and therefore it's organized optimally for what they want to do with it. And I'd like to illustrate that by talking about organization of data relative to the kinds of questions you're trying to answer with data. So consider this as a data set, and consider every coin here as an individual datum. And if I were to say to you, how much fruit can you buy with this money? You might be able to take a guess, but it's going to take you a little while to try to count it up in your head. If I'm a database purist, I would say, well, the best way to store those data are dimes, pennies, nickels, and quarters. I don't remember the height of a roll of quarters and what it's worth, or a roll of nickels anymore, so it's still difficult for me to compute instantaneously what kind of things I could buy with this pile of money. If I were to take the same thing and generate very non-uniform looking stacks, but I told you each one is $1, suddenly it's easy for your brain to compute in a rough way what you can get with the data that you have here. Well, the same thing is true as we try to answer more complex data with computers. Different representations allow computers to operate fast or slow, depending on what it is you're trying to answer. One example of that I'll give you in a real case here is medical claim data. And hopefully nobody in the room has had these 3 type of major things happen to them in a year, but let's assume that you did. When have you ever gotten a year's worth of medical bills that was this simple? Fix your leg, repair your heart, treat an infection, and just one price associated with it? Probably never. In fact, what you typically get is something that looks like this. This is a real data set of insurance claims. It's been anonymized. But this represents one day with one patient, 8 separate insurance claims, 21 line items on those claims. And as hospitals look at how to optimize, they're looking at not these individual little claim items. They're looking at, did somebody who have a broken leg come back in for treatment of a sepsis infection because of something we did to them in the hospital, right? And so it's very difficult to distill those kind of events out of this kind of data. And so we've done some work in that area in the past. If we are lucky enough to distill events out of a series of transactions, the kinds of questions we want to ask about those events are typically different than we would ask of other data. These are time series data, so we want to know things like, did a certain thing occur within a certain amount of a time of another thing? And we may think about representing this as a tabular set of data. It makes perfect sense to do that. But when you do that, what you end up with is a case of joining tables that can get large. So at some point, this probably doesn't scale. And in fact, the kind of questions we more often want to know is, did X, Y, and Z occur within some series of time intervals? And here, you can envision in a standard way, joining these tables together definitely doesn't scale. So here we're looking at some of the more time series oriented data structures, and we don't have our answer chosen for doing that yet. But these are definitely the kind of questions people want to efficiently answer. Another example of generating streams of medical data that we're coping with that has to have similar treatment are data streams that come from electronic devices. And give great credit here to Anne-Christine Catlin for work she did with something called the INFUSION pump informatics platform. If you're not familiar with an infusion pump, this is the thing that sits by your bedside and administers medication into you as you're in the hospital. And one thing that these pumps do is that as nurses set them up to deliver medications, if the way they've programmed them lies outside of typical boundaries, it generates alerts that maybe you're going to get overdosed or underdosed, or maybe even dosed with the wrong thing. So as these alerts are generated, they're collected in a database, and a variety of over 100 reports can be generated out of these data now. Today this is sitting at about 19 million records, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. That's not a giant data set, but it's respectable. So before I get further into that project, I want to talk about really sort of a genius way that Anne-Christine worked this project. That I heard yesterday one of the fellows giving a talk saying that we just want to make one biologist happy before we can make a community happy. And the same thing was true in this situation. There's this traditional brick wall between researchers and practitioners where researchers really want data, and practitioners are just too busy on a daily basis with their daily work to be bothered with supplying those data. And so what AC did that was really smart here was she forgot about researchers for a while and said, I'm going to create something that practitioners can use on a daily basis, and it gives them value, it shortens their work every day. Oh, and by the way, while that's happening, we're actually gathering all this data on the back end. Researchers can now access these data, and that's what really enabled this round trip of translating research back into practice. So that was a very smart way of handling that. It goes with the theme, again, that we heard yesterday about satisfying the individual before you satisfy the group. And what happened was then that a group did get satisfied. Today this is running at 123 hospitals and growing. And what's really, really interesting about this community is even though it's combined of nonprofits and for-profits, they all agree as part of signing up for this community that they will share their data with each other. So anybody can run a report on anybody else's data and see where they stand. And this is something that you find around industry, that people are very reluctant to share product development and intellectual property in that perspective, but they're much more likely to share safety data with each other because of the implications of what it can do for the organization. So what comes next with this platform, and where does our challenge come in with this disorganized data? Well, these pumps don't only generate alerts when you set them up, they generate a constant stream of data once the device is turned on and begins administering the medication. So it's actually generating a lot more information. And not only that, there are many such bedside devices that are all connected to you, They're all made by different vendors. None of them are meant to talk to each other or work with each other. And yet what our clients in this case want to do is they want to unify the information coming out of those devices, measure it with the patient, and correlate it with patient outcomes. And now we start to see this set of records not being 19 million, but maybe approaching something more like 100 billion. That starts to make the question about generating reports a little bit more interesting. Time consuming if you try to use the same approach. Now I know there are those here that would say, well, if it's going to take time, throw more computers at it, right? Well, okay, I'd do that. If it takes too much time, throw more computers at it. And by the way, maybe you could just throw a few more computers at it. In fact, if that gets to be a problem, you probably have bandwidth issues. Throw an advanced database structure at it as well while you're at it. These are all great approaches, but what it doesn't do is it ignores sort of the physics of the problem we're trying to solve. And what I would say is before we go about doing any of that, our approach here is going to be to try to solve this problem initially by developing a series of metastructures on the data that allow easy computation for some of these tasks before we go out and just blindly scale to more computers. So our challenge here is to identify a set of repeatable calculations and an infrastructure to develop these meta-representations that maybe we can't just use for medical device informatics, but others in the room could also use for many of the things that might have the same kind of features as we have here. And of course, I talked about the challenges with transaction to event translation, and scale versus interactivity is a big deal here as well. Hospitals always see it from their own perspective, so if I supplied you 5,000 records last month and I give you another 5,000 this month, it should run at the same speed. I don't care about the fact that you just had 1,000 more hospitals sign up. So we have to be mindful of this as we continue to work on this system. The last trait I want to talk about here is avoiding comparison. People are masters at trying to avoid themselves being compared to others. But as we look at organizations working with data, they really want to know where they are on a map of overall progress against their competitors. So it doesn't suffice to not be comparative. Yet hospitals are masters at doing things that make them impossible to compare against each other. This is 2 sections of a file of the parameters around those alerts that get generated in an infusion pump. And if you look at these 2 different hospitals, you'll see why they can't make it easy to combine themselves with each other. First off, the different units within a hospital never call themselves the same thing across hospitals. They don't even contain the same therapeutic classes of services. They're overlapping, so that makes it very difficult to compute. They don't even name drugs the same thing. You would think there'd be a standard for this stuff, and there sort of is, but they don't use it. You can see one person here wanted this drug to appear last in the list. This is a terrible practice. Yet they do it. It makes it hard to compare. From a more scientific standpoint, the dilution rates and the way they deliver these medications aren't even the same across organizations. So suddenly you have something that sounded like a real easy problem that's actually a real difficult problem. And we found that it's a real difficult problem by looking at the usage data of this system as it currently stands. There are reports within the system called comparison reports, and then there's a whole bunch of other reports. And if you look at what reports get run on a weekly basis here, you really can't see. You can see a little bit the blue reports on the screen here, but they're very small. And yet the evidence that we have that says people want to compare themselves is that's exactly what they tell us when we're on the telephone with them. Well, if we look at those data another way, and we see those conventional reports that don't allow comparison, and we ask the question, how many times did hospital A actually make that report for hospital B versus themselves? Now we get to see that they actually are generating comparison reports. They're just doing it in a way that wasn't hoped for or intended. And what that tells us is that as we design these kind of user experiences, we have to face the fact that we have imperfectly matched data, figure out a way for people to cope with that imperfectly matched data as they try to benchmark themselves, and do it at a large scale. So that's employee challenge number 5. I could actually go on quite a while about other challenges, people who don't network and how we can use data to help people network. Perhaps I'll do that in a future discussion. But I know we're getting close to the end of my time here, and with a little bit of a statement now as incoming director of HUBzero, really is a mixed feeling reaction. And I think many of you hopefully feel the same thing. What can you say about Mike McLennan? You all know him, you work with him. He's an incredibly good guy. From my own perspective, the first time I met Mike was over eggs in the morning in the John Purdue room when I was undergoing the hiring process at Purdue. And ever since that time, I can say confidently that almost every good thing that's happened to me at Purdue has had something to do with Mike McLennan. And that's a good trait. But I think even more importantly, nothing that wasn't good that happened to me had anything to do with Mike McLennan. So that's a real valuable trait. Mike, as you know, leaves a legacy of innovation and actually, more importantly, treating people right. And I hope that as I get a chance to work with more of you over time, that I'm able to at least do close to what Mike was able to do in those cases. And hopefully we'll work together to make those kind of things still happen. Personally, I'm always happy to see someone pursue their dreams. I'm a person who's left a job every 5 years because I got bored and needed to do something else. And when I see somebody else find something they really want to do, it's a sad occasion, but overall, it's something that's great, and congratulations for that. We did learn a little bit more about J&M basements last night at dinner, for those who were at dinner. I'm still not entirely sure what the relation is, but Mike has been carting around these car magnets on his car for at least 5 years, 2 years, a long time. And it was always a little bit of an enigma, and people wondered what it was. Mike also is a big fan of a place called 9 Irish Brothers, if you don't know that already. It's a great pub in Lafayette, and there's one down here in Indianapolis as well. Took this picture of him the other night, maybe a little bit against his will. I thought maybe there's some way to combine these things. And one thing that I know Mike said to you the other day is that one of my roles at Purdue is entrepreneur in residence. And one thing entrepreneurs always need to be taught is that they need to help other entrepreneurs. That's the only way an entrepreneurial community works. So along those lines, the owners of 9 Irish Brothers are entrepreneurs. And I asked them about how they would feel about some advertising out in the Mountain View, California area. They said that would be great, and in fact gave me their artwork to make some car magnets for Mike. So that perhaps he can upgrade the message a little bit on the car. Now, another thing that entrepreneurs know is they need to do everything they possibly can to help themselves. So along those lines, I hope he might adorn the other side of his car with a HUBzero car magnet. So that we can get more press out in California as well, and possibly some clients out in California. So with that, I'd like to close. I invite any of you who have questions about things with HUBzero to just send me an email directly going forward, fill out wish lists like you have been doing, file tickets. I won't be able to provide a lot of answers for you in the initial part of this transition, but the rest of the team is still around, and they're really rich with answers. So we'll try to get that accomplished. So if you have any questions at this time, I'd be happy to answer them, or present you with your magnet.
Oh my gosh, that's wonderful. I wish this jacket was made of metal.
Well, I did come to realize, so we shared a fried turkey a few weeks ago, that Mike isn't actually planning on having his car for a while out in California. And so you may say you shouldn't have, and now I'm thinking Maria might really say you shouldn't have.
It's okay, actually, my car is there now, so
All right.
I'll put it on my car right now.
Cool.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. This is incredible. I love car magnets. It's some of my favorite things. Very good. Any questions for Mike?
Yes.
So Mike, in the early 90s, I was part of this work to define a standard for medical imaging. It was, the medical images were in the same state as you were describing. They were generated from different manufactured devices, and none of them talk to each other. And now I'm thinking it's only, 20-some years. Now, you basically look at images on your screen. All of that was because of the standard. So I'm wondering, with all the difficulties with healthcare information, is there something like that in the works, or what can you say about that?
To my knowledge, there are standards around billing. And billing is that nasty set of transactions that you see in this big long list. There are basically government agencies now saying, basically the hospitals, you're not going to be reimbursed if you don't follow some of these, what they're calling bundled payment standards, and some other new ways of doing this. But it doesn't change the messiness of the transactions. It doesn't allow us to turn transactions into events any easier than it did before, but it does at least make all the database rows look the same. The devices themselves, I'm not aware of any emerging standards for those at all. In fact, vendors have a little bit of interest in keeping their standards somewhat proprietary. They're starting to make money not on the devices necessarily, but on selling consulting services to hospitals that have the devices installed. And they're very focused on consulting for just their device in just one hospital. Hospitals have a social barrier to letting them try to expand out to other hospitals, because it's kind of like sending a sales guy to your neighbor. Nobody wants to do that unless you really hate your neighbor. And they have a barrier in trying to link multiple devices, because these vendors don't make the multiple devices. So there really is an opportunity for a data approach that can unify devices across manufacturers and go to multiple hospitals. And in being a university setting, we're not viewed as salespeople. So we were able to cross that social boundary a lot easier than vendors can.
Other questions? If not, we'll